Nobody on Flight 2847 knew the quiet female pilot in the cockpit had once flown fighter jets at twice the speed of sound. They thought she was just another ordinary captain. But when the Boeing 737 started shaking violently at 37,000 feet and her co-pilot froze in terror, her hands moved with a precision that would save them all, or kill everyone trying. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the tarmac at Denver International Airport as Captain Emma Rodriguez walked through the crew entrance, her uniform crisp and her flight bag slung over one shoulder. She looked like any other pilot reporting for duty on this ordinary Tuesday morning, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her expression calm and focused as she checked her phone for the latest weather updates. Passengers streaming through the terminal paid her no attention as she made her way to the operations office. Just another commercial pilot among dozens who would take to the skies that day, flying routine routes across the country. Nobody gave her a second glance, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Inside the operations office, Emma grabbed her flight paperwork for United Airways Flight 2847, a routine afternoon run from Denver to Chicago on a Boeing 737-800. The aircraft was a workhorse of commercial aviation, reliable and familiar, the kind of plane she had flown hundreds of times during her 5 years with the airline. She reviewed the weather reports, noted a few areas of light turbulence over the Rockies, and signed off on the fuel load and passenger manifest. 147 passengers would be boarding soon, most of them business travelers and families heading home after weekend ski trips in Colorado. It was the kind of flight she could do in her sleep, the kind that required competence but rarely demanded anything extraordinary. Her first officer for the day was Jake Morrison, a friendly guy in his early 30s who had been with the airline for 3 years. He greeted her with a casual wave as he arrived at the gate, coffee in hand and his own flight bag looking considerably more worn than hers. They had flown together a few times before, and he was a solid pilot, methodical and by the book, the kind of co-pilot who made for easy conversation during cruise and never caused drama in the cockpit. As they walked down the jetway together, making small talk about weekend plans and the latest airline gossip, Jake had no idea that the woman beside him had once flown experimental fighter jets at twice the speed of sound or had recovered aircraft from spins that would have killed most pilots. Emma had left that life behind 6 years ago, trading the adrenaline and pressure of military test flying for the predictable rhythms of commercial aviation. After 12 years in the Air Force, including 5 years as a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base and 3 years instructing at the Fighter Weapons School, she had decided she wanted something different. She wanted normal schedules, weekends off, and a life that did not involve pushing multi-million-dollar aircraft to their absolute limits while engineers watched nervously from the ground. She had seen friends die in crashes, had herself ejected from a disintegrating prototype, and had finally decided that she had used up enough of her luck. So she had quietly resigned her commission, taken her commercial pilot licenses, and applied to United Airways like any other pilot looking for a steady job. The airline had been happy to hire her. Her military flight hours and spotless record made her an attractive candidate, and she had breezed through training on the 737 with the easy confidence of someone who had flown far more complicated aircraft. But she never talked about her test pilot days, never mentioned the experimental programs or the classified missions, never explained that she had flown planes that barely deserved the name, aircraft so unstable and dangerous that only a handful of pilots in the world were qualified to test them. As far as her colleagues knew, she was just another former military pilot who had transitioned to the airlines, competent and professional but nothing special. And that suited her perfectly. As they entered the cockpit of the 737, Emma began her pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. She moved through the overhead panel, testing switches and verifying systems, her hands moving with the muscle memory of thousands of hours in similar cockpits. Jake settled into the right seat and began his own checks, and together they worked through the pre-flight checklist with the comfortable routine of experienced crew members. Outside the windows, ground crew loaded bags and fueled the aircraft while gate agents began boarding passengers. It was a scene that played out thousands of times every day at airports around the world, completely ordinary and unremarkable. The passengers filed aboard with the usual mix of expressions, some looking tired, some excited, some already absorbed in their phones and tablets. A businessman in first class glanced into the cockpit as he stowed his bag, saw Emma in the captain's seat and thought nothing of it. A young mother with 2 small children struggled down the aisle, trying to manage carry-on bags and restless kids. A college student wearing headphones found his seat near the back and immediately closed his eyes. An elderly couple helped each other into their seats in row 15, preparing for the 2-hour flight to visit their daughter in Chicago. None of them knew anything about the woman in the left seat of the cockpit except that she would be flying their plane today, and none of them had any reason to think she was anything other than a standard airline pilot. The lead flight attendant, Monica, stuck her head into the cockpit to confirm the passenger count and check if the pilots needed anything. She had worked with Emma before and liked her, found her professional and easy to work with, always courteous to the cabin crew and never demanding. Monica had no idea that Emma had once landed a prototype aircraft with half its control surfaces destroyed, or that she had taught combat pilots how to recover from situations that seemed impossible. To Monica, Emma was just another captain, maybe a bit quieter than some, but reliable and competent. That was all that mattered on a routine flight. Emma made a brief announcement welcoming passengers aboard, her voice calm and friendly as she explained they would be cruising at 37,000 feet with an estimated flight time of 2 hours and 15 minutes. She mentioned the weather was mostly clear with a chance of light turbulence over the mountains, nothing unusual for this route. Her tone was reassuring, the voice of someone who had done this countless times before. Passengers barely listened, most already engaged in their own activities, settling in for an unremarkable flight. The pushback and taxi went smoothly, and Emma guided the 737 onto runway 25 right, running through the takeoff checklist with Jake. The tower cleared them for departure, and Emma advanced the throttles, feeling the familiar surge of power as the twin engines spooled up. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, the nose lifted at rotation speed, and they climbed into the brilliant blue Colorado sky. Denver fell away beneath them, the city sprawling toward the mountains in the west, and Emma banked gently to the northeast, following their filed flight plan toward Chicago. The climb was smooth, and they leveled off at their assigned altitude of 37,000 feet about 20 minutes after takeoff. The Rocky Mountains stretched out below them, their snow-covered peaks magnificent in the afternoon sun. Air traffic control handed them off from Denver Center to the next sector, and the flight settled into the peaceful routine of cruise. Jake handled the radio calls while Emma monitored the flight management system and kept an eye on the weather radar. A few small areas of precipitation showed up ahead, nothing significant, just the usual spring weather patterns over the plains. In the cabin, flight attendants began their service, rolling carts down the aisles and offering drinks and snacks. Passengers read books, worked on laptops, watched movies on their tablets, or dozed in their seats. The young mother finally got her children settled with coloring books. The businessman in first class typed away on his computer, working on a presentation. The elderly couple held hands and looked out the window, enjoying the view. It was a completely normal flight, the kind that would be forgotten as soon as people reached their destinations. Nobody expected anything different. Emma and Jake chatted casually about nothing important, the kind of conversation that helps pass time during cruise. Jake talked about his plans to visit his parents in Florida next month. Emma mentioned she was thinking about getting a dog now that she had finally bought a house. They discussed the airline's new scheduling system, which everyone agreed was terrible, and speculated about whether the company would ever fix the problems with crew pairing. It was comfortable and easy, two professionals doing a job they knew well, expecting nothing more than a routine flight followed by an overnight in Chicago and a flight back to Denver the next morning. They were about 90 minutes into the flight, somewhere over western Nebraska, when everything changed. The first indication was subtle, just a slight roughness in the air that made the aircraft shudder gently. Emma glanced at the weather radar, which showed clear air ahead, and frowned slightly. Clear air turbulence was always possible, but this felt different somehow, more intense than the usual light chop they had been experiencing. She reached for the seatbelt sign and turned it on, then made an announcement asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten their belts. Jake looked over at her, sensing her concern. Before he could say anything, the aircraft jolted hard, a sudden violent motion that threw them against their harnesses. Emma's hands went immediately to the controls, her training taking over. Another jolt followed, harder than the first, and then the Boeing 737 began to shake with a violence neither pilot had ever experienced in commercial aviation. It was not normal turbulence, not the predictable up and down motion of rough air. This was something far more severe, a chaotic battering that seemed to come from all directions at once. The aircraft pitched violently nose down, then snapped back up so hard that loose items in the cockpit flew into the air. Warning lights began flashing on the instrument panel. The stick shaker activated, warning of an approaching stall, even though their airspeed was well above minimum. Jake grabbed the controls instinctively, trying to help, but the forces were enormous, far beyond what commercial pilots normally encountered. In the cabin, screams erupted as passengers were thrown against their restraints. The flight attendants grabbed for anything to hold onto, one of them falling hard into a seat. Emma's mind raced through possibilities as she fought the controls. Clear air turbulence could be severe, but this was beyond anything in her commercial aviation experience. The aircraft was being hammered by forces that felt almost like wake turbulence from a much larger aircraft, but there was nothing on their traffic display, no other aircraft anywhere near them. The weather radar still showed nothing. Whatever they had flown into, it was invisible to their instruments but devastatingly real in its effects. The Boeing 737 rolled suddenly to the right 30 degrees, then 40, the wing dropping toward the earth far below. Emma countered with aileron, but the aircraft kept rolling. Jake's face had gone pale, his hands frozen on the controls, his training in normal commercial operations providing no answers for what was happening. The flight management system was screaming warnings, the autopilot had disconnected, and the aircraft was being tossed around like a toy in the grip of forces that seemed determined to tear it apart. Emma made a split-second decision. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation became unrecoverable, before the structural stress tore something critical loose or the aircraft entered a condition from which standard recovery procedures would not work. She needed Jake off the controls immediately because he was fighting her inputs with his own panic-driven reactions, making the situation worse. Her voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding, nothing like her usual calm captain's tone. She told Jake to let go of the controls completely, to take his hands and feet off everything and let her fly. The authority in her voice, honed from years of instructing fighter pilots, cut through his panic, and his hands came off the yoke. Now Emma was alone with the aircraft, and suddenly she was not thinking like a commercial airline pilot following procedures from a manual. She was thinking like a test pilot facing an aircraft that wanted to kill her, using instincts and skills developed over thousands of hours flying unstable aircraft in conditions that would terrify normal pilots. Her hands moved with precision, making small, exact inputs rather than the large corrections that Jake had been attempting. She was feeling the aircraft through her hands, reading its behavior through tiny feedback cues that commercial pilots never learned to interpret because they never flew aircraft at the edge of controllable flight. The 737 pitched nose down again violently, the nose dropping toward the vertical as they began what could become an unrecoverable dive. Emma did not panic. She had recovered from worse in aircraft with far less forgiving characteristics. She watched the airspeed indicator climbing rapidly, watched the altimeter unwinding as they plunged toward the earth, and waited for exactly the right moment. Pull too soon and the forces would rip the wings off. Pull too late and they would have too much speed to recover. She needed to feel it, to know the precise instant when the aircraft would respond to her inputs without destroying itself. At 32,000 feet and with the airspeed approaching red line, Emma began her recovery. She did not haul back on the yoke like an instinctive reaction would demand. Instead, she applied smooth, progressive back pressure, loading the aircraft's structure gradually rather than shocking it with a sudden force. She was aware of every creak and groan of the airframe, listening to the aircraft tell her what it could handle. The nose began to rise, slowly at first, then more rapidly as the wings began to bite into the air and create lift. But they were not out of trouble. As the nose came up, the aircraft rolled violently to the left, the wing dropping so steeply that Jake let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a shout. The passengers in the cabin were screaming now, convinced they were going to die, some of them praying, others simply holding on in terror. Emma countered the roll with precise aileron input, but she was also using rudder in a way that commercial pilots almost never did, coordinating the controls in a complex dance that came from her fighter flying background. She was not flying by the 737's book anymore. She was flying by feel and instinct, treating the aircraft like a machine that needed to be dominated rather than a system that responded to procedures. The shaking continued, relentless and brutal, but Emma was beginning to understand its pattern. Whatever atmospheric phenomenon they had encountered, it had a rhythm to it, a cadence of forces that she could start to anticipate. She began making tiny inputs just before the aircraft would pitch or roll, preempting the forces rather than reacting to them. It was like riding a wild horse, moving with the animal rather than fighting against it, using its own energy against itself. Her hands never stopped moving, making constant small corrections, keeping the aircraft from entering any extreme attitude that could become unrecoverable. Jake watched her with a mixture of awe and confusion. This was not how commercial pilots flew. This was something else entirely, something he had never seen before in his years of airline flying. Her movements were too precise, too confident, too much like someone who had flown in conditions far worse than this. He wanted to help, wanted to do something, but he realized that anything he did would only interfere with whatever she was doing. So he stayed off the controls and focused on backing her up, calling out altitudes and air speeds, monitoring the systems, being her second set of eyes while she fought the aircraft. In the cabin, the scene was one of pure chaos. Overhead bins had popped open, spilling bags and coats into the aisles. Drinks and food were everywhere, splattered across seats and passengers. The young mother was holding her children and sobbing, trying to shield them with her body. The businessman's laptop had flown across the cabin and shattered against a wall. The elderly couple clutched each other, their faces white with fear. The flight attendants were strapped into jump seats, their training keeping them in place even as their hearts pounded with terror. They had all been told by the captain that there might be light turbulence. This was not light turbulence. This was violence beyond anything they had imagined possible in an aircraft. Emma's focus was absolute. She had shut out everything except the feel of the aircraft under her hands and the information streaming from the instruments. Altitude, airspeed, attitude, vertical speed, engine parameters, all of it flowing into her consciousness and being processed with the efficiency of a computer. She was burning through her mental energy at an incredible rate, the kind of intense concentration that could only be sustained for limited periods, but she could not afford to let up for even a second. One wrong input, one moment of inattention, and the aircraft would enter a condition she might not be able to recover from. The turbulence continued for what felt like an eternity but was actually less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes of the most violent flying conditions that anyone on that aircraft had ever experienced. 3 minutes during which Emma Rodriguez used every bit of skill she had accumulated over 18 years of flying, drawing on experiences that ranged from test flying experimental aircraft to teaching pilots how to survive combat maneuvers gone wrong. She flew the 737 like it had never been flown before, coaxing it through conditions that should have been impossible for a commercial airliner to survive. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the violence stopped. The aircraft broke free of whatever atmospheric nightmare they had encountered, and the air became smooth again. The 737 was still flying, still under control, its engines still running steadily, its basic systems still functioning despite the battering they had endured. Emma held the aircraft steady for a long moment, making sure the turbulence was truly over, then finally allowed herself to take a deep breath. Her hands were shaking now from the adrenaline, but the aircraft was stable. Jake stared at her, his face still pale. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, not sure what words could possibly capture what he had just witnessed. Emma glanced over at him and saw the questions in his eyes, but there would be time for explanations later. Right now, she needed to assess the situation, figure out if the aircraft had sustained any damage and get everyone safely on the ground. She keyed the intercom to the cabin and asked Monica for a report on injuries and damage. The flight attendant's voice came back shaky but professional, reporting that several passengers had minor injuries from being thrown against their restraints, one flight attendant had a possible broken wrist from falling, and the cabin was a mess but structurally seemed intact. No one had been killed, which was a miracle given the violence of the turbulence. Emma thanked her and told her to secure the cabin as best they could and prepare for landing. Then she contacted air traffic control and declared an emergency. The controller's voice came back immediately, asking for their status and intentions. Emma explained they had encountered severe turbulence, had possible structural damage, and needed priority handling for an immediate landing at the nearest suitable airport. The controller quickly determined that Des Moines International Airport was about 80 miles ahead and to their left, and began coordinating their approach. Emma thanked him and began configuring the aircraft for descent. She flew the approach manually, not trusting the autopilot after the beating the aircraft had taken. She tested the controls gently, feeling for any damage or abnormal response. Everything seemed to work, but she kept her movements smooth and cautious, not wanting to stress any potentially weakened structure. Jake worked beside her, running checklists and handling radio communications, but he kept stealing glances at her, his mind clearly racing with questions about what he had just seen. The landing was smooth, Emma putting the 737 onto the runway with barely a bump despite her earlier fight with the aircraft. Emergency vehicles were waiting as they taxied clear of the runway, fire trucks and ambulances following them to the assigned parking area. Emma brought the aircraft to a stop and shut down the engines, then finally allowed herself to relax her grip on the controls. Her entire body was trembling now, the aftermath of the adrenaline surge, and she felt suddenly exhausted. The next hours were a blur of activity. Paramedics came aboard to treat injured passengers. FAA inspectors arrived to examine the aircraft and interview the crew. Airline management showed up, concerned about the incident and its implications. Emma answered questions calmly and professionally, describing what had happened in technical terms, explaining the unusual characteristics of the turbulence and the recovery procedures she had used. She was careful not to mention her test pilot background, sticking to explanations that a senior commercial pilot might reasonably provide. But Jake was not satisfied with her careful explanations. Later, after the passengers had been taken care of and the aircraft had been secured, he cornered her in the crew room at the Des Moines airport. He looked at her with an intensity she had not seen from him before and asked her directly what had really happened up there. He told her he had been flying for 10 years, had thousands of hours in 737s, and he had never seen anyone fly like that. He said what she had done was not normal airline flying, that the way she had handled the controls, the precision of her inputs, the confidence in her recovery technique, all of it suggested a level of skill that went far beyond commercial aviation training. Emma looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She could continue to deflect, to minimize what had happened, to hide behind her carefully constructed identity as just another airline pilot. But she saw something in Jake's eyes that made her decide differently. He was not asking out of jealousy or competition. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand what he had witnessed, because he knew that whatever she had done had saved all their lives. So she told him. She explained about her 12 years in the Air Force, about the test pilot program at Edwards, about the experimental aircraft she had flown and the emergency procedures she had developed for situations that were supposed to be unrecoverable. She described spins and fighters that had killed other pilots, structural failures that should have ended in crashes, control system malfunctions that left her flying aircraft that barely responded to normal inputs. She explained that she had learned to fly aircraft at the very edge of their capability, in conditions where conventional flying techniques would fail, and that those skills were what had saved them today. Jake listened in silence, his expression shifting from surprise to something like awe. When she finished, he shook his head slowly and said he could not believe she had been flying for the airline for 5 years without anyone knowing what she could do. Emma smiled tiredly and told him that was exactly how she wanted it. She said she had left that life behind because she wanted to be normal, wanted to fly passengers from point A to point B without pushing herself and her aircraft to the absolute limit. She said she had hoped she would never need those skills again. But life had other plans, Jake pointed out. Emma nodded in agreement. She supposed it had. They sat in silence for a while, both processing what had happened, both aware that they had come much closer to disaster than most people would ever know. Finally, Jake asked her what she thought had caused such severe turbulence in clear air with no weather returns on radar. Emma admitted she did not know for certain, but her best guess was a rare phenomenon called mountain wave rotor, a violent rotating turbulence that could form downwind of mountain ranges under certain atmospheric conditions. The Rockies could generate such waves, and if they had flown into one at cruise altitude, it would explain the violence and the sudden onset. The official investigation would take weeks, but Emma's explanation would eventually be confirmed. The Boeing 737 had encountered a severe mountain wave rotor, a phenomenon rare enough that most commercial pilots never experience it in their entire careers. The violence of the turbulence had exceeded anything in the aircraft's certification testing, and by all rights, the aircraft should have sustained more serious damage than it did. The investigators would conclude that only exceptional piloting had prevented a crash, and when they interviewed Emma more extensively, the truth about her background would finally come out. The story broke in the aviation press within days. Reporters discovered that the pilot who had saved United Airways Flight 2847 was not just another airline captain but a former Air Force test pilot with a record of accomplishments that read like something from a movie. News outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the narrative of the unassuming female pilot with a secret past who had saved hundreds of lives using skills most people did not know she possessed. Emma hated the attention, but there was no avoiding it now. Her carefully guarded privacy was gone. United Airways wanted to use her story for publicity, to showcase the exceptional skill of their pilots. Emma refused most requests for interviews and public appearances, uncomfortable with being treated as a hero. She insisted she had simply done her job, using her training to handle an emergency. But her colleagues saw it differently. Pilots who understood what she had accomplished began treating her with a new level of respect, recognizing that having someone with her background in the left seat was an incredible asset that few airlines could claim. The passengers from Flight 2847 had their own reactions. Many of them reached out to Emma through the airline, sending letters and emails expressing their gratitude for saving their lives. The young mother wrote that she had been certain she was going to die and leave her children without a parent, but Emma had brought them safely through. The businessman said he had flown millions of miles in his career and had never experienced anything like that turbulence, and he wanted her to know how grateful he was for her skill. The elderly couple sent a card thanking her for giving them more years to spend with their grandchildren. Emma read each message and felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was glad she had been able to save them, glad her training had proved valuable when it mattered most. But she also felt exposed in a way she had not anticipated. The quiet anonymity she had valued was gone, replaced by recognition she had never sought. She wondered if she had made a mistake in leaving her test pilot career, if perhaps she should have stayed in that world where exceptional skill was expected rather than surprising. Jake became something of a friend after the incident, one of the few people who truly understood what had happened that day. They flew together occasionally when scheduling permitted, and he never tired of asking her questions about her past experiences, about the aircraft she had flown and the situations she had survived. Emma found herself opening up more than she had in years, sharing stories she had kept to herself, finding relief in being able to talk honestly about the life she had left behind. The Boeing 737 they had been flying was eventually repaired and returned to service after extensive inspection and structural repairs. The turbulence had caused damage that was within reparable limits, but it had been close. Engineers who examined the aircraft told Emma privately that the forces recorded by the flight data recorder should have caused more serious structural failure. They theorized that her smooth control inputs during the recovery had prevented the kind of sudden shock loading that would have broken critical components. Once again, her training had made the difference between survival and disaster. 6 months after the incident, Emma was invited to speak at a conference on aviation safety. She initially declined, uncomfortable with public speaking and reluctant to be held up as an example. But the organizers persisted, explaining that her experience had important lessons for the entire aviation community about handling extreme situations and the value of diverse pilot backgrounds. Eventually, Emma agreed, deciding that if her experience could help other pilots or improve safety, then the discomfort would be worthwhile. She stood before an audience of hundreds of pilots, instructors and aviation professionals and told them the story of Flight 2847. She described the turbulence, the recovery techniques she had used, and the skills from her test pilot background that had proved critical. But she also talked about something else, something she had been thinking about for months. She talked about how commercial aviation had become so focused on procedures and standardization that exceptional skills were sometimes undervalued or even discouraged. She said there was a place for creativity and adaptability in the cockpit, for pilots who could think beyond the checklist when situations arose that no checklist could cover. Her speech received a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of pilots approached her to share their own stories of situations where thinking outside the box had made the difference. A veteran captain told her about recovering from a complete electrical failure using techniques he had learned flying cargo planes in Alaska. A former military pilot described saving an aircraft after a bird strike using combat flying principles. Emma realized she was not alone, that there were many pilots in commercial aviation who carried with them skills and experiences from other parts of aviation that might prove vital in a crisis. Emma went back to flying the line after the conference, returning to the routine of commercial operations. But something had changed. She no longer felt like she was hiding her past or pretending to be someone she was not. Her colleagues knew who she was now, what she had done, and what she was capable of. Some of them treated her differently, with a respect that bordered on deference, which made her uncomfortable. But others simply treated her as a skilled professional, acknowledging her background but not making a big deal of it, and that suited her fine. She still preferred the quiet routines of commercial flying to the intensity of test flying. She liked knowing that most of her flights would be uneventful, that she could go to work without wondering if today might be the day something went catastrophically wrong. But she also accepted now that her past was part of who she was, that the skills she had developed over years of extreme flying were not something to hide but rather something to maintain and value, because you never knew when they might be needed again. A year after the incident, Emma was promoted to check airman, responsible for evaluating and training other pilots. It was a role that recognized her exceptional skills and experience, and she found she enjoyed teaching again, helping other pilots develop their abilities and preparing them for situations they hoped they would never face. She became known as a demanding but fair instructor, one who pushed pilots to think critically and maintain their skills rather than just memorizing procedures. Her students respected her not because she was famous for saving an aircraft, but because she genuinely cared about making them better pilots. On the anniversary of Flight 2847, Emma found herself sitting in the cockpit of a 737 at Denver International Airport, preparing for another routine flight to Chicago. It was almost exactly the same flight she had been operating that day, same route, same aircraft type, similar time of day. Her first officer was a young woman named Rachel, newly upgraded to the 737 and eager to learn. As they ran through the pre-flight checklist, Rachel asked Emma nervously if she ever worried about encountering severe turbulence again after what had happened. Emma smiled and told her that she did not worry about it, but she was prepared for it. She explained that the key to handling emergencies was not to fear them but to train for them, to maintain your skills so that if something unexpected happened, your training would take over and guide you through. She said every flight was an opportunity to practice, to stay sharp, to keep the mental circuits fresh so that when they were needed they would work. Rachel nodded, absorbing the advice, and Emma could see the young pilot's confidence growing. As they pushed back from the gate and began another routine flight, Emma reflected on how much her life had changed in the past year. She had gone from being anonymous to being recognized, from hiding her past to accepting it as part of her identity. She had learned that you could not truly leave your past behind because it was woven into everything you did, every decision you made, every skill you possessed. Her years as a test pilot had shaped her into the pilot she was today, and that day over Nebraska, those years had saved lives. The flight to Chicago was smooth and uneventful, just as Emma preferred. No turbulence, no emergencies, just a professional routine execution of a commercial flight. They landed on time, passengers deplaned with barely a thank you, and Emma and Rachel headed to their hotel for the overnight. As Emma walked through the terminal, pulling her flight bag behind her, she looked like any other airline pilot at the end of a workday. Nobody gave her a second glance, and that was fine with her. She did not need recognition or attention. She just needed to know that when it mattered, when lives were on the line, she had the skills and the courage to do what needed to be done. In the years that followed, Emma continued flying for United Airways, building a reputation as one of the airline's most skilled and respected pilots. She flew thousands of hours without another major incident, proving that dramatic emergencies were indeed rare in modern aviation. But she never forgot that day over Nebraska, never forgot the feeling of fighting an aircraft that seemed determined to tear itself apart, never forgot the responsibility of having so many lives depending on her skills. That experience had reminded her why training mattered, why experience mattered, why having pilots with diverse backgrounds and exceptional abilities mattered. She eventually became a training captain, helping develop the airline's upset recovery training program and teaching other pilots how to handle extreme situations. She drew on her test pilot experience to create scenarios that challenged pilots to think creatively and react quickly, preparing them for situations that standard training did not cover. Her program became a model for other airlines, and she took pride in knowing that pilots across the industry were better prepared because of her work. Emma Rodriguez never became famous outside of aviation circles, and that suited her fine. She did not want fame. She wanted to fly, to teach, to make aviation safer. She wanted to use her skills and experience to help others, to pass on what she had learned during those years of extreme flying. And she wanted to live a normal life when she was not working, to come home to her house and her dog and the simple pleasures of a life that was not constantly testing the limits of human capability. But she also knew that if she ever found herself in another situation like that terrible day over Nebraska, she would be ready. Her skills might have come from a different world, from a time when she flew alone in experimental aircraft over empty deserts, but those skills were still there, still sharp, still available when needed. She was not just an airline pilot. She was a pilot with capabilities that few could match, and while she hoped she would never need them again, she was grateful to have them. The passengers who boarded her flights never knew they were flying with someone who had once pushed the boundaries of aviation, who had flown aircraft that existed at the knife edge between controllable and catastrophic. They saw a professional pilot, competent and calm, just another captain in a uniform doing a job. And that was exactly how Emma wanted it. She had learned that true skill did not need to announce itself, did not need recognition or praise. It simply was, existing quietly until the moment it was needed, and then proving its worth through action rather than words. Flight 2847 became a case study in aviation schools, an example of how exceptional pilot skill could overcome conditions that exceeded the aircraft's design limits. The incident was analyzed, studied, and discussed by pilots and engineers around the world. But for Emma Rodriguez, it was simply a reminder of who she was and what she could do. She had been tested in the most extreme way possible, and she had not been found wanting. That was enough. That was everything.